So, first ladies have long been seen as elite women, right? Of little interest, except maybe in relationship to their husbands or uncles or fathers, right? But they really actually burst into our understanding in a different way beginning in the 1980s. And that was because there was a growing interest in women's history at that time, coming out of the 70s, coming out of that movement. And it launched new scholarship on first ladies, including much of the work of the presenters here today. These studies have contextualized these women, taken them off their pedestal, placed them in their times. Historians have wrestled with such aspects of First Lady's work as professional responsibilities and roles, communication styles, relations with the press, political activities, feminism, even their physiques. However, the influence of place has received relatively little attention. The South's political and cultural clout has long exceeded its population and its wealth, and the peculiar notions of race that dominated the South remain largely unchallenged in the nation for decades. Given this outsized influence, it's not surprising that first ladies from that region have played a vital, if not always recognized, role both in and beyond Washington. This regional stamp defined and challenged and shaped these women and their approaches in a multiplicity of ways. But yet, until now, historians have largely overlooked this collective regional influence on these women and the legacy that came from it. We aim to address that oversight today. We are drawing on memoirs, personal papers, scholarly literature of all kinds. And we're going to show how this regional background defined, challenged, and shaped these women and their approaches to their positions in ways that we continue to reckon with. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce our proper introduction, which is very lucky that we are to have Katherine Al Gore, who is visiting us here today as president of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Formerly, she was at the Huntington Library and at University of California, Riverside, and she is an expert on early American first ladies, including Dolly Madison and Catherine Adams, and she's published on both of these women on a number of other topics. So please give a warm welcome to Katherine Al Gore. Thank you.
Good morning. What a pleasure it is to be here today. I thanked some of you in person, but I want to thank you as a body for coming out on a rainy and early morning. It's a pleasure to be here at the George W. Bush Presidential Center, and it's an honor to open today's proceedings. Welcome to, and it's got to be one of the better titles, Southern Belles, Washington Balls, and Dixie's Reach, How Southern First Ladies Changed America's Compass. On behalf of all the panelists, if I may, I'd like to thank our host, Jeffrey Engel, and many thanks to Ronna Spiff, in one place and in good order. We also owe a large debt of gratitude to Catherine Sibley, who you just saw. She's been the inspiration and moving force for today's events. She brought us all here together today, as well as ably shepherding us through 2 book projects. Speaking of debts of gratitude, all of us who study First Ladies owe many to the George W. Bush Presidential Center and to Southern Methodist University. Since its inception, the center has supported and advanced the serious consideration of the words, work, and lives of the women who took on the role of First Lady or who had it thrust upon them. Under the leadership of former First Lady Laura Bush and Professor Anita McBride, the study of First Ladies has become a major initiative of the center, and much of what you'll hear today represents the ongoing fruit of their efforts and support. So thank you to Mrs. Bush and to Professor McBride. It was here, yes, I think a little applause is in order. There you go. Thank you, Anita and Anita. It was here in 2013 that I made a presentation, a case, if you will, on why we study First Ladies. And the first answer to that question, why do we study First Ladies, was why not? If we look at First Ladies simply as potential historical subjects, they are as worthy of study as any individual. The women who occupy the post are often dynamic, interesting, compelling women. It's no accident that they are the spouses of men who are either charismatic enough or intelligent enough to get elected to the highest office in the land. On the basis of availability of sources alone, first ladies can be excellent historical subjects. And I always use the example of Louisa Catherine Johnson Adams, who, until Eleanor Roosevelt, was the most literarily productive president's wife. So she had a variety of writings, diary entries, letters, poems, autobiographies, and their musings on class and slavery and society in the U.S. are worthy of historical consideration, and not just because she was married to a president. But these women were married presidents, and many of them shed light on their particular presidential administrations. And you're going to hear a lot of examples of that here today. But at the very least, as Cokie Roberts asserts, these women's observations and experience make their presidential menfolk seem less like marble statues and more like flesh and blood humans. An excellent historical subject is one whose life is worth studying because it tells us not only something about what it was like to be a human being in a certain historical context, but something profound about that context as well. Studying first ladies can tell us about topics beyond their own individual experiences. For instance, their words, actions, and work, and how they were received by the American public can inform us about the role or state of women at a certain time, about gender roles in their individual historical context. Taking the work of first ladies seriously also uncovers part of American history that's not available in a presidential or male narrative. And that's probably the most radical thing I'm going to say in my little introduction. This idea that we learn something different from them is a new idea for First Lady studies. So back in 2013, when I reviewed the field, I noted that most work about First Ladies was sort of collective treatments that recycled faulty information. So you'd hear some piece of lore and you'd read it over and over again. There was a lot written about First Ladies, but not much of it was scholarly, meaning researched with primary sources and written in accordance with the highest standards of historical scholarship. And also, curiously, when you looked at anything written about First Ladies, it was always sort of strictly biographical. Happily, thanks to the spotlight and support provided by institutions such as the Center and this university, and by visionary editors such as Catherine Sibley, First Lady studies have deepened analytically and in historical sophistication. Bringing First Lady studies into the field of academic history, asking new and ever-evolving questions of the material, we are moving past the biographical. Now, don't worry, you're going to meet some fascinating ladies today. You're going to meet Dolly Madison and Verena Davis and Lady Bird Johnson and, yes, Mrs. Laura Bush. But their lives will also open lenses on issues such as international diplomacy, progressive politics of the 1920s and 1960s, and American activism, among other historical issues. First Lady is not the only pioneering analytic category we will discuss today. To say that there's a strong link between First Ladies in the South seems such an obvious statement as to admit of no contradiction. The very first woman in the role, Martha Washington, was a Virginian, and that rock-ribbed New Englander, Abigail Adams, only followed her lead. The next woman to occupy the president's house, Dolly Payne Todd Madison, was not only herself a Southerner married to a Southern man, but brought a social style that was indubitably Virginian to the national capital. Dolly's Southern style not only defined the Madison administration, but set the pattern for future First Ladies that takes us into our own era. But as Katie Sibley mentioned, it's very understudied, so it's an obvious association, but understudied. And you're going to learn today, going past that easy association of the role with the region, things become more complex. In many ways, Southern First Ladies bring the most traditional gender conventions to the role, affirming our impression of the South as inherently more conservative, more ladylike, if you will, and that's capital L lady, right? Ladylike. But a closer look shows a long track record of Southern women using those very gender conventions to further conversations that seem progressive, even transgressive, on issues such as war, diplomacy, race relations, and mental health. So I hope I've whetted your appetite. Let's begin our day together with the first panel. Thank you.
thank you all for coming. My name is Lindsay Travinsky. I'm one of the postdoctoral fellows here at the Center for Presidential History, and it is my great pleasure to introduce everyone for the first panel this morning. I thought I would introduce all of our speakers, and then they can just take it away, and I won't be interrupting any of their work. Our first paper will be given by Diana Bartley Carlin, who is a professor emerita of communication at St. Louis University and a retired faculty member and administrator at the University of Kansas. Dr. Carlin's teaching and research centers on political communication with an emphasis on political campaigns and debates and women in politics. Her interest in First Ladies grew out of her study of early women in politics. She has taught a course on the rhetoric of First Ladies and has authored book chapters on Lady Bird Johnson, Hillary Clinton, Barbara Bush, and Michelle Obama. Our next speaker, Mary Ellen, or Melly, is that correct? Schofield is an assistant editor with the papers of Thomas Jefferson at Princeton University. She contributed the chapter on Benjamin Harrison and Cleveland women for a companion to the First Ladies, and has written articles on the Jefferson and Madison periods. As a side note, I'd like to editorialize that she has a fantastic article on Jefferson's dinner parties, which my students will be reading next week for our class, on the presidents in the early America period. Her latest article, House of Cards, The Politics of Calling Card Etiquette in 19th Century Washington for Commonplace, complements a book manuscript she is completing for Vanderbilt University Press on early Washington society. She also holds a PhD in history from Wayne State University. Christopher Leahy, is that right? Leahy holds a doctorate in history from Louisiana State University, where he was a student of William J. Cooper. He is a professor of history at Cuba College, located in the Finger Lakes region of New York State, which I have to personally say, my mom is from the town of Penn Yan, and so as a small world, that's where that town is, and I'm amazed to see it, and it brings joy to my heart. He has published scholarly articles on President John Tyler, and most recently co-authored the chapter on the Tyler First Ladies for the Wiley Blackwell, A Companion to First Ladies, which came out in 2016. He has finished a full-scale biography of President Tyler, which is under contract with the Southern Biography series of LSU Press, and he is currently at work with his wife on a full-scale biography of First Lady Julia Gardner Tyler. Which brings us to his lovely wife, Sharon Williams Leahy, who holds a master's degree in historic preservation from the Savannah College of Arts and Design. She is founder and principal of History Preserve, a historic preservation and heritage consulting firm, and is the co-author of the chapter on John Tyler First Ladies for the Wiley Blackwell Companion. She is currently at work on that biography, which I think we can all agree will be a lovely work on First Lady Julia Gardner Tyler.
Put that down. Otherwise, you can't see me, one of the hazards of being short. Let me also very quickly offer my thanks to everyone involved with this. It's exciting to be part of this project. First Lady scholar Carl Saferza Anthony wrote of Martha Washington that if Providence itself had divinely intervened, a woman who better looked and played the part could not have been found. And interestingly, though, our First Lady is rather enigmatic, as other authors about her have written. And a large part of that is that she did something that a later First Lady, Bess Truman, did. And that was Martha burned every single letter except 5 that escaped her in the back of a drawer that she didn't know were there, between her and George Washington, from the time they first met until he died. So upon his death, she burned it all. Now, for those of us who like to deal with primary source material, this makes writing and talking about Martha a little difficult because there isn't much primary source material. There is, however, a very large collection of letters that Joseph Fields edited of Martha that she wrote to about business, to her relatives, to some of her friends, but they don't say a lot about Martha. So most of what we know about Martha was Interesting to pull this together simply because, as any other biographer, and as Katherine mentioned, you have to contextualize. And with Martha, there are a lot of gaps to fill in. And a lot of those gaps are filled in with apocryphal information, and we don't really know how to sort the fact from the fiction, a little like the cherry tree and George tossing a silver dollar across the Potomac, which every time I fly over it, I really wonder how he did that. So the way I approached this was I began my paper with contextualizing what it meant to be a Southern woman in Virginia during the colonial period, during the Revolution and immediately after. So I had to dig into Southern women's history, which really came to the forefront in the late 70s, early 80s, at the time when gender and women's studies were really growing in this country. Two of those first women who studied Southern women were Joanne Hawks and Sheila Skemp. And they wrote that the history of Southern women is enveloped in myth and fantasy. Images of Southern women are more likely to be found on the pages of Gone with the Wind than in history books. And so in looking at what they all collected about Southern women, we have the steel magnolia image, we have the Southern Belle, a lot of what's in the title of this. And I think in contemporary society, we tend to look at Southern women as a little more conservative, kind of from the Bible Belt, very religious. But what did Southern women in Martha Washington's time look and act like? One other historian pointed out that if we're going to look at them, we have to make one other distinction, and I think it's important to think about this throughout the day today. Carolyn Dillman wrote that women of the South are very different from women in the South. And when she talks about women of the South, what she meant were women who were not only born and reared in the South, but more importantly have a heritage of Southern culture and generations of Southerners in their family background, as opposed to women who are residing in the South. So what were those women of the South, especially of Virginia, where Virginia as a colony was far more important because we didn't have a country at the time. So people really identified with their colony as much, if more than anything else, because they were British citizens. So I found 6 characteristics that I want to talk about that really then shape our understanding of Martha. The first was that we have this notion of spheres, that there was this very clear division of spheres. There was a domestic sphere and there was a public/political sphere. But as biographers of Martha and others who write about the 18th century colonies talk about in Virginia specifically, is that division of spheres was pretty permeable. And economic conditions and other conditions such as a Revolutionary War often meant that those spheres merged. And even within Southern plantation households, oftentimes the men were just as concerned about what was going on in the mansion house as the women were, and the women were concerned about the economics of it all. And many of these women were widowed, as Martha was at one point, and they had to run it, or at least get help. So this notion of spheres was very different. Also in Virginia society, women were at a lot of events, especially in Williamsburg during the season when there were dances and when the Burgesses were in session, and they were privy to those conversations. But they were also there because everyone really thought that those women would make the men more moral, and they would pay more attention to the needs of the women and children and everyone else who wasn't represented. So they played a very important part politically, so those gender differences weren't quite as great. The second was that relationships were incredibly important. And a woman in this period was really reared to take care of her husband and her children, but also to be very much a part of her community, and she had to create that community. And her relationships with other women, both enslaved women and women in her community, became integral to who she was and how she did what she did. The third one kind of came out of this notion that relationships are what helped them survive, because these women's lives were not all magnolias and mint juleps and tea parties and balls. Even the women in these elite classes were out overseeing the supervision of smoking the hams. Martha herself smoked the fish because George wanted it a particular way. They were literally doing heavy lifting. They were treating the illnesses of both their children and their husbands and their enslaved workers. And so there was a lot that they were doing that really wasn't totally ladylike. So in order to really survive all of this, they had to be very tuned in to what was going on. And so they had to avoid tackiness. And tackiness was defined as a failure to act appropriately and a lack of sensitivity and insight into the response of others. The Southern lady was constantly alert to what was going on around her and the implications of those events for her and for her family, because part of her job was to make sure that her husband's prestige and power were preserved, and that she and her children and other members of her family did nothing to diminish that. So this sensitivity to being very much in tune with everyone was a very important part of being a Southern woman. A fourth element was that Southern women were very religious. Sunday church was a major event, and it was also something that brought the community together. But Martha was known for reading her Bible every day, for ending her day with prayer, and the family Bibles really attested to how much use they got, and her grandson wrote about her real dedication. So this was a very important part, because religion kept them buoyed because they had so many losses. Life was very precious, and children died in infancy or as toddlers, spouses died, and so family took on very different meanings, and religion helped them because these were blended families, some of the time second and third spouses and children from multiple families. And then there was the notion of family within the enslaved group, and Martha and George were very much the same as any other Southern plantation owner, where they really talked about their family, black and white, and looked at those family as almost part of the family. Even at the time, there were very contradictory feelings about all of this. So religion helped keep them going. For slaveholding women, as I said, this whole notion of where their slaves fit into the family became very important to them, and they were as much dependent on those slaves for everything as the slaves were on them for their food and shelter. The final thing was this notion of what is a lady. And while the idea of a lady is not unique to the South, it took on real prominence in the South. In fact, one writer said that in the South, women were really elevated to a sort of secular sainthood if they achieved this notion of a lady. So the fact that during the Revolutionary War, when Martha traveled with George, she was called Lady Washington. And part of this was also a vestige of being a British colony, where royalty and the term lady was very common. And even though we wanted to throw off those shackles, there were parts of that royalty and those terms that it was very difficult for us to shed. So how does Martha fit into these 6 kind of characteristics? Well, first of all, Martha was of the South. She was a 4th generation Virginian on her mother's side. Her grandfather had been a minister in Williamsburg. Her great-grandfather, her grandfather was a member of the House of Burgesses. Her mother's family, the Jones family, were not grandee plantation owners, but they were in that second tier, which is where George Washington was originally. Martha was the oldest of 8 children, so what do we know of her? She was the oldest of 8 children. Her mother was Frances Fanny Jones Dandridge. Her father was John Jack Dandridge. He had come to the colonies at the age of 15, along with his brother William. He became a deputy clerk in New Kent County, where she was born, eventually became a clerk. He was a colonel in the militia, but most importantly, he owned 500 acres of land. And on that land, he produced tobacco, which made him part of this plantation society. So Martha was raised in that society, even though it was a second tier, but because it was a smaller plantation, and they had maybe 15 slaves, some of which came with Fanny as her dowry, none were in the house. So Martha learned how to run a house, and Martha was doing all of these things that women did at that time from a very young age in helping take care of young children. So the other things we know about Martha are that she did marry Daniel Parke Custis when she was 18 years old, and that was an interesting story. He was 20 years her senior. He managed one of his father's 5 plantations, ironically named White House, and she was the only one who didn't live there. So a lot of irony there, which was close to the Custises, and he was a vestryman in the church along with her father. So he would have watched her grow up from the age of 7 to 18, and she became a very attractive woman, and at that point he began courting her. His father, John Custis IV, was the wealthiest man in Virginia and quite eccentric, and he could not find any woman who was good enough for his son, so he thwarted most of his romances. When he started courting Martha, John Custis publicly castigated the family and said that he would disinherit his son, who was his only legitimate heir, if he married Martha. Showing a little of her mettle and what Martha Washington was like, Martha asked to meet with John Custis IV. No one will ever know what was said, but after that meeting, he told his friends that he was willing to let his son marry Martha, that she had character, and he had to have admired her spunk. And that's part of what came from being a Southern woman at that time. So unfortunately, he didn't live to see the wedding. He died 6 months before they were scheduled to be married. And Daniel came into an inheritance of almost 18,000 acres of land, 300 slaves, multiple farms, and about $100,000 in cash. Martha was a very capable administrator, having learned well from her mother, as most young women did. Education was a part of being a lady, and so they learned reading and writing and ciphering, and they read the classics, and they learned how to play a musical instrument. And Martha supposedly played the spinet. She sang also, from what we found from some letters. That was all part of being part of this genteel society and being able to mix and mingle with men and make small talk. So she managed this very large farm, plantation, White House. But after 7 years of marriage, 4 children, 2 of whom died in infancy or as toddlers, she was widowed at the age of 26. Unlike other women, she decided she was going to take over management of the plantation herself, and in Joseph Field's collection of letters, you see how she used a very firm hand to tell all of her husband's business associates that she expected them to treat her exactly the way they treated him, and the implication was, if you don't, there are other people who want my business. So she was very much a woman who was strong in and of her own right. But as someone wrote, widows in the 18th century, especially one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest woman in Virginia, were very sought-after commodities. So George was vying for Martha's favor with another very, very wealthy man, Charles Carter, who was a widower, 24 years older, with 12 children. And he was writing all these letters. He was sure he was going to land Martha. But George happened by a house one day, and there is dispute as to which house it was, whether it was the Bassett family, which would have been Martha's sister's family, or whether it was the Chamberlains, who were friends of George Washington's, to water his horse. He was told that the widow Custis and her 2 children were having dinner with them, and would he like to stay? He changed his mind about just watering his horse and leaving. And he ended up staying the night so that he could continue his conversation with her the next day. He then wrote to her, tried to see her whenever he was in Williamsburg, because obviously Mount Vernon is a little north of Williamsburg. And so Martha chose George. They were married, and where they were married, just like where she was married to her first husband, is disputed among historians. Some say it was at White House for both weddings. Others say it was in St. Peter's Church in Williamsburg. And so actually in the church, they acknowledge this dispute. So this is why I say it's very difficult to nail down facts about a lot of Martha's life. So Martha went to Mount Vernon. George moved her and her 2 young children, who were 2 and 4, to Mount Vernon. And he now has taken over because of British law. All of her property now is his, although she has her dower third of Daniel Parke Custis's property, but she still has to let George help her manage that. But what the record shows us is that she spent money without George's permission. There are letters to that effect. And George often hired, if they were hiring individuals to work at the house, George often was the one who hired them, not Martha. So they split this notion of spheres. They entertained hundreds of people. It was a revolving door. And part of that entertainment was to establish George's credibility in the colonies and to show the power that he had because of these vast holdings that he not only had at Mount Vernon, but what he had inherited from Martha. So she certainly played that role. She was incredibly attentive. At one point, at the time the revolution was starting, she was accused of being a Tory, a little like Mary Lincoln, who was accused of being a Southern supporter. And so what she did was she packed up her children and some of her enslaved labor, and she went to George's winter camp and proved that she was supporting him. Every single winter, Martha went to camp with George. She nursed the sick. She sewed. She got other women in the community to knit and sew. And she and Benjamin Franklin's daughter and one of Benjamin Franklin's daughter's friends And Martha Jefferson and other women in the colonies, with Martha running this, raised over $300,000 to provide clothing for the soldiers at a time when they were about ready to mutiny because they simply were ragtag. So this notion of attentiveness to her surroundings was incredibly important. So when George became president, we did a very interesting thing. We made the head of state and the head of government one person. And that is unusual in the world where one person has that role. You often have a president and a prime minister, and one is the head of state and one's the head of government. They had no idea really what they were doing when they put this together. You know, it's very broadly defined, and they didn't even know what they were going to call George. It took a while to come up with the title, so you can imagine where Martha and First Lady and her title fit in. But it was really, it was almost like, if you use a 21st century metaphor, they were flying the jet at 35,000 feet and still assembling it. And that meant that there were some missteps, there were, changes. And so what George and Martha had to do was figure out how to create this republic, be democratic, but also create a presidency that had stature and that would be admired by individuals coming from the courts of Europe who only knew monarchies in the courts of Europe. So that was their real challenge, was this delicate balance. And because Martha had that background as a hostess, had had hundreds of people through Mount Vernon, had sat through political discussions, Martha was able to walk that line most of the time. She had a few missteps, and if I have time, I'll talk about one of them. So the Washingtons came up with a plan, and Martha arrived on the New Jersey shore. George met her in a 47-foot presidential barge. She landed in New York to a 13-gun salute, and people began yelling, "Long live Lady Washington." So her name from the Revolution continued. She didn't particularly like it. She wanted to be called Mrs. Washington, but everyone called her Lady, and it went back to that whole Southern tradition. So she brought Southern hospitality to the White House. She would have receptions, drawing room receptions on Friday nights. George had what they called levees. On Tuesdays, in between, she had an hour every day from 11 to 12, where anyone who was dressed appropriately could come in and see her, and she would leave immediately at 12. They would end these evening events at 9, and she would stand up and say, "The president usually retires at 9, and I leave before him." So this very gracious, attuned to how do you do these things appropriately. She also continued her charitable works, and this was where she took on the cause of the veterans. And one of the things that she spent a lot of time on was veterans issues, personally giving money, appealing to George to oftentimes provide leniency or commute a sentence for somebody who'd been a veteran and had been accused of something. She also went to the Congress to make sure that the veterans had a pension. 1 minute? Yeah, got my time. So, with all that said, what was her legacy then? It was this notion of a partnership. We've seen books on the modern first ladies, and Margaret Truman and Gil Troy have written about this, that it was a partnership, but it was a partnership from the beginning. And when George picked her up in the presidential barge, he made it clear that it was a partnership. And he and his advisors had already decided on what her social activities were going to be, starting with the second day that she was in New York. She also showed this hostess role as being incredibly important. And this is in one of the books that's been put out by the Bush Institute. They talk about this notion of soft power, and that the hostess role is an excellent example of soft power, and Martha knew how to use that. The notion of her cause. Every first lady, modern first lady, has had a cause. Martha really set that. Also, taking care of your husband and family. And if you stop and think, when Michelle Obama, who we consider to be a very 21st century woman, said, "My first job is first mom." And so this, and we think about Nancy Reagan tending to her husband after the assassination, Mamie Eisenhower after the heart attack. Those were important things because George was sick a few times, and Martha became his surrogate. So she led the way to be the surrogate for the president. So all of those things Martha did, she left as a legacy. And my final line of my paper is, Martha Washington created a role without a pattern. Every woman has woven her own story as a first lady to create a unique design, but the raw materials are the same as Martha's. So thank you. If you can indulge me 1 second, I have a few pictures. This is Martha with her first husband. This is an artist's rendering of the marriage of George and Martha, put it in a very elaborate place. Those are actually Martha Washington's shoes that are at the First Lady's Library in Canton, Ohio. And this is a swatch from her wedding dress that her granddaughter gave as gifts to individuals with a little case. Oops. Not sure what I just did. Oh well. Anyway, a couple examples, and I had some others, but I'm going to pass this on so we can stay on time. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks for the thanks to the youngins here. So, and I apologize. First, I will be stepping on Diana's toes a little bit because I will talk about Martha, but Dolly and Martha's lives do intertwine in Philadelphia. Okay. I will start here. Born of Quaker parents and raised. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, am I in and out? Short. Testing, testing. Is that good? Okay. No, because I don't want anyone to see me. I was like, yay, a screen. What if I? Okay. Yeah, don't, Katie, really. Okay. Yeah, I've got to get in my rhythm here. Okay. Born of Quaker parents and raised in Virginia, Dolly Payne lived a Southern life until her family moved to Philadelphia when she was a teenager. In 1790, she married Quaker lawyer John Todd, only to lose him in 1793 to the yellow fever epidemic. The next year, widow Todd met and married James Madison. Under any marital or monetary circumstances, it's hard to imagine Dolly Madison not having led a hospitable life, but it need not have been a particularly Southern one or one of lasting prominence. James Madison gave her a Southern future, both at Montpelier and in Washington, and his political ambitions would eventually build the stage from which Dolly would make her own history. Now a member of Capital Society's inner circle, she watched as fellow Virginian Martha Washington performed her duties. With no established precedents to guide them, the Washingtons had established a set of social protocols, ones they hoped would give dignity to their position while respecting the nation's hard-fought principles of republicanism. On Thursdays, the Washington held a formal dinner for the elite members of the political community. On Tuesdays, the president gave his levee, and on Fridays, Martha Washington held her drawing room. And unlike her husband's Tuesday levee, she welcomed both men and women. In a society in which the making and receiving of calls was primary, the Washingtons deemed that their title required others to call on them first. While General Washington made it a rule not to return his calls, the First Lady did, making the rounds among the political and local genteel women who had waited on her. Dolly Madison's education in political protocol as practiced in Philadelphia ended with the Adams administration and her husband's retirement from Congress. Although the couple spent the next 4 years at Montpelier, James Madison's focus on national politics never lessened, as he worked with then Vice President Thomas Jefferson to strengthen the emerging Republican Party. In the same interval, Dolly Madison continued to hone her social political skills, overseeing frequent Montpelier entertainments, which were often the byproduct of Madison's political activities, and participating in Richmond's political society during her husband's term in the state legislature. Thomas Jefferson ran for president in 1796 and lost. He ran again in 1800 and won. He did win. Oh, yeah, there he is. Okay. TJ won. James Madison, to no one's surprise, but I can't see through the mic and the thing here, to no one's surprise, became his Secretary of State. And after a 4-year hiatus, the Madisons would be returning to the national seat of government, now located along the Potomac River. The new federal capital was much a work in progress, and it was receiving mixed reviews. Federalists and foreigners spoke of it with the most disdain, while Southerners like the Madisons felt most at home, and rightly so. The nation's new capital was in a southern location. Its small local elite society were Southerners. The terrain, the isolation, the lush flora, the ungodly summer heat all spoke of the South, as did the prevalence of servitude, both among those who labored in the district and those at the local auction houses. Many cities in 1801, North and South, claimed an enslaved population, but not all could claim the irony of servitude in the capital of a country that boasted of its democratic principles. As the mistress of Montpelier, Dolly Madison appears to have accepted her dominance over the men, women, and children she legally owned, including her right to buy and sell them as property. Although her husband's enslaved manservant, Paul Jennings, wrote that she was loved by all, black and white, her relationship with him and the others under her control would always be one of master to slave. Even Dolly Madison's historic Southern hospitality was tied to servitude. The welcoming nature of Virginians like the Madison relied on the work of an enslaved staff. The credit and the pleasure of entertaining a guest goes to us, wrote one Virginian, while the drudgery falls on our slaves. A large number of the Republicans who came to dominate the new capital were Southerners, and they, like most of the others in their party, were pleased with the move to the Potomac. For them, the unspoiled location represented a blank slate upon which to build a proper Republican capital, one devoid of the monarchical pomp and ceremony practiced by the administrations of Washington and Adams. From the White House, Thomas Jefferson's dress took on a form more like a farmer than a head of state. Presidential processions and ceremonies were abandoned in place of levees and formal affairs. Jefferson held, in place of ceremonies and formal affairs, Jefferson held his frequent, relatively small dinner parties. But off of the White House grounds, it was a different story. 19th century genteel women in general led polite society, and despite the political posturing of their husbands, Federalists and Republicans alike, that was also the case in the new republic. Their role, as it was elsewhere, would be to oversee and preserve the protocols that gave society its order and ensured its civility. In the nation's capital, which had the potential for being very uncivil, their role took on a particular importance. Their presence in Washington was valued for its ability to provide a level of decorum and courtesy, whether in the parlor, at the dinner table, or in congressional galleries. The value of their presence became the source of their power. As these women mingled among the men who ran the nation, they influenced opinions, championed their own causes, and served as ambassadors to their husbands. No one did that better than Dolly Madison. As the wife of the Secretary of State and the highest-ranked woman in residence, she led the way, fostering relationships with families across the district and building lasting relationships that fostered her husband's ambitions and her own. In 1809, Dolly Madison moved into the White House as the second presidential spouse to grace its rooms and the first to serve longer than 3 months. With the support of social Washington, she made official the courtesies and protocols that she and the women of Washington had honed during the prior administration. They included many of the precedents set in Philadelphia, ones which Dolly Madison managed to employ with a pleasing Republican twist. If you went to the exhibit, you saw this. It was big and told. As the president's lady, she accepted her place at the head of every promenade. Nonetheless, she happily took the arm of whoever was chosen to escort her. She worked to fashion the White House into a palace, but she ensured one visitor who had peeked into a few rooms without leave that the mansion belonged as much to the public as it did to the current residents. She returned to the foreign ministers the social status they had lost under Jefferson, setting the tone at the inaugural ball when she was led to dinner by the capital's highest-ranked foreign envoy. In keeping with past protocol, she maintained the right of first call, but did so disarmingly, once writing a new arrival in the city to hurry to the White House so they could begin their friendship. And she returned every call made to her. The Madisons also brought back the tradition of the weekly presidential reception. In a precedent that would continue for decades, they combined the gentleman's levee of the first two presidents with the drawing rooms of their wives to create a single weekly reception. James Madison attended the drawing rooms, and in future administrations, the president often took the lead role, but not so during the Madison years. These Wednesday nights belonged to Queen Dolly. Amid a crush of guests, she circled the room, encouraging light conversation and social harmony, and modeling the congeniality being mirrored in parlors across the city, where women like the First Lady maintained sociability and civility amid differing political views and ideologies. During her 16-year reign, Dolly Madison led her capital sisters in their creation of a civil and harmonious social Washington, guiding the way with her own Southern hospitality and her appreciation for genteel etiquettes. Beyond that, she proved the power of a kind word. Examples abound of those she won over with a gracious comment or a bit of sincere flattery. After having her drawing room entertainments attacked by a Federalist on the House floor, Madison won over a second Federalist with her forgiving manner. A Federalist wife invited to a Madison dinner found herself treated with distinction by Dolly despite their husbands' political differences. Cabinet wife Mary Crowninshield was pleased when Madison twice admired her wardrobe, and Sally Seton, wife of the newspaper editor, felt the same flattery at a large White House party when Madison not only made sure that she was introduced to all her other guests, but insisted that Seton play a waltz for the ladies after dinner. In 1817, in 1817, the Madisons retired to Montpelier. James Madison died in 1836. A year later, the newly widowed Dolly Madison began her seasonal returns to Washington, eventually making it her permanent home until her death in 1849. She found a much larger city full of men who no longer prescribed to Jeffersonian republicanism, but who were instead a mix of Whigs and Democrats with deepening political differences. But Madison also found, and apparently had never doubted, that the wives and daughters of these men still insisted that capital society follow the same rules of etiquette, decorum, and civility laid out by their founding sisters. Because of that, her encore decade in Washington, mentoring First Ladies from Van Buren through Polk and modeling sociability in parlors across the city, worked to further cement into practice what she had helped create decades before. During her first year back, the New York Herald published a piece on Dolly Madison written by one of the newspaper's anonymous correspondents. The reporter, himself a bon vivant of capital society, did I do that French really well? Had been asked if he would like to meet Dolly Madison. "Mrs. Madison," said he, "nothing would afford me so much pleasure. I am very desirous to see a lady of the old school and of the reign of pure Virginian democracy." He wrote of taking a carriage to the Madison home, where he and his companion were welcomed with great courtesy and politeness. He noted how Madison inquired kindly about the family of his companion, who was herself an older woman of the city. A number of callers appeared during their visit, and the hostess had treated each of them really swell. Correspondent had listened as his companion bemoaned to Madison the bitterness of party feelings, and while she expressed relief that it had not spoiled society, which still mingled harmoniously, the three then gossiped about the city's foreign ministers, who, said his companion, now as in your day, Mrs. Madison, are all the go. The reporter was delighted with Dolly Madison. He praised her past achievements. What he failed to see, despite the clues so affably laid before him, was that the woman who had graciously received him was far from a relic. If the reign of pure Virginia democracy associated with her husband had disappeared with changing politics, what Dolly Madison had brought to the city, and what she would continue to reinforce for another decade, had not. It was everywhere, in the rounds of calls that ignored political alliance, in the hospitality received indiscriminately from families on both sides of the congressional aisle, even in the exalted social status of the foreign ministers. Dolly Madison's old school etiquette was Washington etiquette, and both it and she had proven themselves more durable than the politics that had initiated her reign as Washington's queen. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I wanted y'all to see her handwriting. It's very challenging to read. She likes to crisscross, and my husband always says she has a handwriting only a mother can love. And I know that to be true because now I'm wearing reading glasses, so this is a true thing. At first glance, one may not necessarily think of Julia Gardner Tyler as a Southern First Lady. After all, she was born on Gardner's Island, which is located just off the tip of Long Island, and she was raised in East Hampton and educated in New York City. By geographic criterion, perhaps she should be considered a Northern First Lady, and additionally, she only served as a White House hostess for a very short time, only about 8 months. Yet during her lifetime, and especially the years after the Civil War, Julia Gardner Tyler came to the cold realization that she may not be remembered as a First Lady at all. Fortunately for Julia, she was endowed with some rather helpful personal traits. She had tremendous drive and tenacity, and she had an innate ability to understand people and what motivated them. And she used these traits to good effect for the challenges that she had during her life. And she thought executively. Once she formed a plan, she strategically carried out and implemented tactics to achieve her goals. For example, she, on a trip to the White House in July of 1868, she met with Andrew Johnson, and she told him, "You need to honor the ladies that had served as White House hostess by hanging their portraits in the White House." And so, to no one's surprise, she, when she returned back to New York, acted upon the idea directly. And she packed up the first portrait of a White House hostess, one of her own, and shipped it express mail to Johnson. And for good measure, she included directions on which rooms he should hang it in. Either the blue or the green reception rooms were the ones she preferred. And yet, Johnson was at the end of his presidential term, and he was on the way out of the White House, and former Union General Ulysses S. Grant and his wife Julia were on the way in. So the White House staff, not quite knowing what to do with this portrait, promptly stored the first portrait of a First Lady, unopened, in the White House attic. And there it stayed. So Julia donated this particular portrait not for the merely purpose of adding to the White House art collection. She wanted to reinforce the point that her marriage to a sitting U.S. president made her First Lady for all time. More importantly, her donation was not just an act of benevolent generosity, but rather a shrewd first step in a strategy in a 10-year quest for Mrs. Ex-President Tyler to reclaim her status as First Lady and to obtain a pension from the federal government.
So the question becomes, why did Julia Gardner Tyler come to the realization that she might not be remembered as a First Lady at all? Why did she feel the need to reclaim that status? Well, put bluntly, by 1868, most Americans did not care about Julia Gardner Tyler or for her. In the view of much of the American public, she had lost her status as First Lady because of her connection to the South. In 1864, a friend of Julia's, Petersburg, Virginia native Mrs. C.F. Walker, wrote to her that we consider you in the South as one of our own possessions. Certainly Northerners would have concurred with that sentiment. Julia realized that in order to reclaim her status as First Lady and to win a pension, she would need to recast herself and shed the stigma of being on the losing side of history. Now, Julia's quest to build a Southern identity began almost from the moment she said "I do" to President Tyler in June of 1844. The marriage was quite titillating for many people. Julia was 30 years younger than her new husband, which prompted the New York socialite George Templeton Strong to say that Tyler was a poor, unfortunate, deluded old jackass to think that he could actually make a woman that young happy. The Tylers, however, preferred the sentiment of their friends, who referred to their marriage as the union of the useful and the beautiful. Now, at the time of her marriage to John Tyler, the president was in pursuit of the annexation of Texas. It was going to be his signature issue. The newspapers actually had fun with this as well. You see here on the left a newspaper tongue-in-cheek report comparing the Treaty of Annexation with Julia Gardner to the Treaty of Annexation that John Tyler was trying to work out for Texas. The caricature on the right indicates that by the time of his marriage to Julia, John Tyler had abandoned any real hope of becoming president in his own right in 1844 and was instead getting ready to go in hot pursuit of the lovely Julia and the alluring Texas. Unfortunately for both John Tyler and Texas, or for John Tyler and Julia, Texas equaled the defense of slavery. The pursuit of annexation equaled the defense of slavery, with all of the sectional connotations that had by the end of his term. And Julia, of course, became tarnished by association, especially in light of the fact that she would lobby members of Congress to support annexation towards the tail end of her husband's term. Julia's association with the South took on a more tangible form in March of 1845, when she and her husband moved to their plantation in Charles City County, Virginia, Sherwood Forest, where she became the mistress of more than 60 enslaved people. In 1853, Julia picked up her pen in her letter to the Duchess of Sutherland, in which she defended slavery and defended the institution and defended the South in the wake of criticism from England. The Duchess of Sutherland and several of her well-heeled English friends had essentially pressed Southern women to use their moral advantage to abolish slavery. Julia's message in this letter was, it was published in the Southern Literary Messenger, a very prominent publication at the time, and her message to the Duchess of Sutherland was essentially, stay out of our affairs. And of course, Julia now had written proof of her defense of slavery and defense of the South, which many Northerners never let her forget. Now, during her marriage, Julia took many steps of her own volition to solidify her status as a Southerner, to shape her Southern identity, but it was actually something over which she had very little control that hurt her the most and hampered her ability to win a federal pension and reclaim her status as First Lady. In April of 1844, John Tyler voted with the majority in the Virginia Secession Convention, voting to sever the ties with the Union. And later in that year, John Tyler joined the Confederate government. He died before he could actually take his seat, but the damage had been done. When he died, the disdain for what Northerners called the traitor president ran deep. Newspapers in the North barely mentioned his passing in January of 1862. President Lincoln actually ordered that all flags in the nation's capital fly at full mast in an effort to perhaps punish his predecessor for his role in the rebellion. So this image that John Tyler had fashioned for his wife stuck to her long after he and the Confederacy were gone. Julia compounded the damage. She became a staunch Southern partisan during the Civil War. She actually moved back to New York. You see her house here on the left, Castleton Hill. It was her mother's house. She moved back there in 1864, and she quickly clashed with her older brother David, who was staunchly pro-Union. The two of them also fought tenaciously in the courts over their mother's will. Julia had expected to receive an infusion of cash. She had 7 children with the settlement of the will, but her brother basically took her to court, and the legal fees really chipped into any of the settlement. She also won 3/8 of the settlement of her mother's property in Manhattan. You see some of those properties here on the right-hand side of this slide. 3/8 of the property should have netted her some money, but she found that deferred maintenance costs, unpaid rents, and unpaid taxes really chipped away at any of the financial benefits. The situation concerning her property in Virginia was not much better. Sherwood Forest had been mortgaged several times. Julia had been sued for unpaid taxes, and indeed she almost lost the property to creditors. Julia began to realize that not only was her association with the South tarnishing her reputation, but her poverty was diminishing her in the eyes of many people as well. There were other indications of her loss of status. Reporting on her visit to Washington in July of 1868, the same visit to President Johnson that my wife referenced a few minutes ago, the Capital newspaper gloated that Julia demeans herself publicly and privately. Another newspaper reported that Julia Gardner Tyler was the only ex-First Lady who had not received the franking privilege from the federal government. Other First Ladies had been allowed to send mail for free. Julia conspicuously was not one of them. By 1870, Julia realized that she would need some significant financial help, and she began to think about pursuing a pension. Mary Lincoln had won a $3,000 pension from the government in 1870, so Julia started thinking that this was perhaps a way that she could retain some of her solvency. She knew she couldn't do it alone, however, and enlisted the help of powerful allies in Washington. Among them, shown here in the middle, is her chief attorney, William Evarts. Evarts, perhaps enjoying taking on lost causes, had been Andrew Johnson's defense attorney during his impeachment trial. He will later defend Henry Ward Beecher in the famous or infamous adultery trial later. He will become Secretary of State. So Evarts was a heavy hitter, and Julia certainly enlisted his help to try to find a way to win this pension. Shown there on the bottom right is Congressman John Good, her congressman from Virginia. And then on the left is Virginia Senator Robert Withers. She enlisted the help of all 3 of these men in more than a 10-year quest to win that pension. However, when she approached Evarts about the idea in 1870, Evarts pretty much told her that now was not an opportune time. Radical Reconstruction was in full swing. The acrimony over the Civil War was still very much present in Washington. Northerners were, as they say, waving the bloody shirt. So Evarts advised her to back off and to bide her time. Her sons were livid that Julia would even consider supplicating herself before the very people that had defeated the South in the Civil War. So she was, both for political reasons and personal reasons, decided, at least for a time, to remove her petition and bide her time. She strategically withdrew. In the meantime, her reclamation project continued apace. At one point, she gave 2 female authors, Mrs. E.F. Ellett and Mrs. Laura Holloway, who published books on the Washington social scene in the late 1860s and early 1870s, she provided them with some biographical detail in an effort really to mount a public relations campaign and to get her side of the story out there. Mrs. Ellett's book, shown on the left here, was a little bit better in that regard. She gave a little bit more space to Julia. Laura Holloway, whose book is shown here on the right, devoted all of one sentence to Julia's stint as First Lady, and it was a sentence of pretty much faint praise at that. Julia sensed that there was an opportunity that was lost here, but she did not dwell on that disappointment. She looked for other ways to try to reclaim her status as First Lady. In 1870, she moved to Georgetown, which made it easier for her to attend Washington social functions. For example, in 1878, Lucy Hayes, President Hayes's wife, invited Julia to stand next to her in a receiving line at a levee at the White House. So Julia began to really raise her profile in the Capitol in a mostly positive way by the late 1870s. Ultimately, Julia realized that in order to secure the pension, she would have to make it more compelling for people to remember that she had been a First Lady than that her husband had turned against the United States and that she had supported the Confederacy. And she believed that winning the pension would serve as the ultimate evidence that her reclamation project had succeeded. By the late 1870s, the two goals had really become mutually reinforcing. By the spring of 1879, William Evarts advised Julia that the timing was right to resubmit the pension petition. It had been 9 years since Mary Lincoln had received her pension. Reconstruction was over. The situation was starting to turn a little bit in Washington. Julia had not entirely convinced her sons of the wisdom of pursuing the pension, but she did get the go-ahead from Evarts and did decide to pursue it once again. Naysayers in some quarters, however, were determined to quash her chances and aimed barbs in her direction. One Washington newspaper resurrected the charge that her husband had been a traitor. New York Congressman William Robinson, who on the floor of the House of Representatives sort of offhandedly said that Julia had been a brilliant light at Washington social scenes. Apparently she had dressed pretty well, so maybe she doesn't need the money. Robinson obviously failed to grasp that Julia believed she had to act like she had been First Lady before she could be treated like one, that is, receive the pension. In December of 1880, Congress awarded Julia a pension of $1,200. It was a start. Late in 1881, Congress awarded Mary Lincoln a pension of $5,000. That sounds better. On March 29, 1882, the 92nd anniversary of her husband's birth, incidentally, tomorrow is the 228th anniversary of his birth. There'll be a party at the Lumen tonight. Congress granted Julia, Sarah Polk, and Lucretia Garfield, shown here, their own $5,000 pension. Mrs. Ex-President Tyler had at last triumphed in her quest to both reclaim her status as First Lady and win a noteworthy federal pension. Julia's victory, of course, was enormously significant for her personally. It ensured her financial solvency for the rest of her life. She was now a First Lady in good standing once again. Now, the symbolism of Congress awarding pensions to First Ladies from both the North and the South at the same time, I think, is suggestive. The process of sectional reconciliation that began after Reconstruction was in full swing, and perhaps the members of Congress believed that now was the time to do their part. In his study of the memory of the Civil War, David Blight examines the development of lost cause mythology of the South, which institutionalized what he calls an abiding sentimentalism of the Southern past. Julia had none of that abiding sentimentalism. She chose to move forward, not remain wedded to her past. She would not apologize for her actions as a Southern woman, but she decided that she wanted to move forward. As always, she took the world as she found it and acted accordingly. In effect, she made it easier for members of Congress to award her the pension.
So you may be curious to know what happened to that portrait of hers. Well, by 1872, Julia was living in Georgetown in a rented house with her youngest daughter and her granddaughter, and one Saturday morning in February of that year, she packed the girls into a carriage and they traveled to the White House to pay a call. She handed her card to the White House steward and she asked that it be taken up to Mrs. Grant along with a request for an audience with the First Lady. She and the girls would tour the East Room and the White House gardens. Mrs. Grant agreed to meet with them and asked that some food be brought up to the residence so they could all have lunch. And when Julia arrived, the two ladies shook hands. Mrs. Grant was very friendly and gracious. And after lunch, she showed Julia her old rooms and at last revealed the location of her portrait. The portrait hung over the piano in Mrs. Grant's parlor. Julia had not seen it in 3 years, and she looked at it a long time. She looked at herself in the dress that she had worn on the occasion of her marriage to President John Tyler 28 years before. How happy were her prospects then? And her memories of that happy time moved her to tears. When Mrs. Grant observed Julia's tears, she thought how sad for her to come back unknown to the White House where she was once its honored mistress. Mrs. Grant admitted to doing everything she could to make Julia feel at home, to embrace a woman who was at one time on the complete opposite side of the political spectrum. Not only showed Mrs. Grant's good manners, but also her great sensitivity and compassion. She was the one that discovered the portrait in the attic. She had it cleaned and placed where she believed that it should have been placed all along. Mrs. Grant understood the demands placed on a woman who served in the role of First Lady, and she realized that acknowledgement of that role was very important. Displaying the portrait paved the way for the recognition of Julia Gardner Tyler's time as First Lady, and it fortified her for her reclamation project and her pursuit of the government pension. And the sight of the portrait finally hanging in the White House moved Julia immeasurably. Thank you.
So we now have a few minutes for questions. I'm sure people have some thoughts after those great papers. There is a microphone in the back if you'd be willing to stand back there so everyone can hear the question and we can also capture it, everyone's contributions for later. So the question, let me just, oh, excellent. Perfect.
The question, can you hear? Okay, great. The question was, what was Martha Washington's concept of what she should be? Well, she didn't really come in with a preconceived one. I mean, no one really knew. Like I said, they were inventing this as they went along. And George and his advisors had decided what her role was going to be, and that it was primarily the hostess role, which once again, stop and think about who these men were and what role in the Southern society, especially for George, that Martha would do something similar in the presidential house that she had done at Mount Vernon. And so when she arrived, they told her that she would have a dinner the next night, because he was inviting some of these diplomats in, and then she had this Friday reception coming up. So she was talking about how she just didn't even have time to unpack. And they also had told her that because they were trying to balance this notion of the Democratic part of the presidency and the office with having the stature of a president who was slightly above you, we still want somebody you can drink a beer with, but who's smarter and everything else than us. It's been that tension the whole time that she could not return calls. So for the first, that they couldn't dine privately, that there was this kind of setting them aside. And so there was a little of that. So after a year of not being able to return calls, she finally went to George and said, enough is enough. I'm a lady. I need to do this. We need to be out among people. And so she changed that. But her real concept was that, I think, continuing to do what she had done, being that kind of conduit to listen to the polite conversation, influence George where she could, and she did, and try to do nothing publicly or say anything publicly because it was back to what she had learned in her Southern roots about not doing anything to diminish her husband's stature.
I had thought that it had been really late in time that presidents got pensions. Can you kind of describe when how the pension system became official?
Well, actually, ironically enough, Julia's husband, John Tyler, started the whole notion of giving largesse, pension largesse, to either presidents or widows of presidents. When he took over the presidency upon William Henry Harrison's death in April of 1841, he pushed for and signed a bill that granted Mrs. Harrison $25,000, which would have been her husband's salary, which was the presidential salary, which is actually, adjusted for inflation, is actually more money than the president makes today. So he pushed for Mrs. Harrison to receive the $25,000 pension, and I think incrementally over time it sort of built from that. Mary Lincoln rather aggressively pursued the idea of a pension after her husband died, and at one point Congress had granted Mary Lincoln $25,000 prorated for the year that he would have served had he not been assassinated. But she pushed for more, and Congress began to, almost in dribs and drabs, give first ladies, ex-presidents' wives, these pensions, culminating with the $5,000 that were given to given to Mary Lincoln, and then ultimately Sarah Polk, Lucretia Garfield, and Julia. So it developed over time, I think, is the best way to look at it.
Question was the Tuesday levees that the president had, who was invited and what happened. These were by invitation only. They were oftentimes some of the leading people in either New York or Philadelphia. They were diplomats who were coming in from other countries, and they were once again pretty formal. They at one point he had an open door policy in addition to the levees that were a little more formal. He just said, well, anybody can come in and see the president. So people were in all the time, members of Congress, other people in the administration, and he finally had to then set some specific hours because he wasn't getting anything done. So like I said, that balance of being accessible but also being presidential, it took them a while to sort all of that out.
I taught 8th grade forever, and we never used to. We just grew things. Can you hear me now? No. Close. Hello. There you go. Okay. Yeah, Washington's levees were gentlemen only, and then Martha Washington came, but he came as a guest, and then these were her nights particularly. Mrs. Adams and John followed the same procedure. And when they went to Washington the last couple months that Adams was president, he kept up the levees. You hear people talking about going to levees with a black band on their arm because he had lost his son. But Abigail Adams, they gave a New Year's party, but there's not much evidence that she had drawing rooms. She did, though, return calls. She was out and about, and I'm telling you, it is not easy to return a call in Washington, D.C. in 1800. You are bouncing around in a buggy forever. Okay. And then, of course, Jefferson banished levees, so there was no way he was going to have what Washington and Adams had. And he didn't do drawing rooms. He didn't have a first lady. And I will say, when his daughters came, they did not do a formal drawing room either. But I will also say, you don't need a formal drawing room in a size, the town of that size. the women were coming and going all the time from the White House when he was there. So, and then by the time Dolly came, she instigated the one that I talked about before.
You mentioned the New Year's Day receptions. The Washingtons started that, an open house on New Year's Day, and that was their attempt to allow the public to come in. They continued until the Hoover administration. And then when we were in the middle of the Depression, the Hoovers ended them. And also he had lost, and they just weren't up to seeing anybody again. But that was something that continued for that whole period of time.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, Alexis. So the question is just, what is the difference between the Southern and the Northern First Ladies in terms of the Adams were very genteel, but perhaps there was a difference. So where does that Southern difference come out?
I think some of that had to do with money and with what they were doing. When you read Abigail's letters, particularly about entertaining, there's a little complaining going on there. And when they moved to the White House, she's like, there's 14 fireplaces in here, and I have just me, and they had a couple that helped them. That was the difference. And so she also had that whole kind of Yankee New England thing where she wanted to be practical. She talked about the food that they had to spend and the money. I don't think they were as wealthy and that affected her. And whether that's a Northern thing or a Southern thing, it seemed to be popular.
I think that's exactly right. Mount Vernon supplied a lot of the food and other, for the White House. And people were going back and forth. One of the things I didn't have time to talk about was the fact that the Washingtons brought slaves into the president's house in both New York and Philadelphia. And the 11 presidents following Washington, 7 of them also brought slaves into the White House. So Martha had all of this help. Abigail didn't, because they were Northerners. They did not have slaves. She didn't have this huge plantation to supply food and everything else that they had. So that was one big difference in terms of the way they entertained. But I think the biggest difference between, and Abigail just followed the pattern. Even though Abigail wasn't a Southerner, she followed those protocols that Martha had established because they were part of what they were trying to do with creating this image and this tone. But Martha's big difference was she was highly political. If you remember the letter she wrote to John when they were writing the Constitution, you'll remember the ladies will foment a rebellion. Martha was never that political. Abigail was talking to members of Congress, going up to the Capitol. None of that was being done because the Southern women weren't as overt as the Northern women were.